Okay, so welcome everyone, and whenever you're watching this, whether it's morning, evening, whatever, thanks for taking the time to check it out. Today, I have a guest I'm really excited to talk about, or talk to. I have Edward Slingerland, who is, I'm going to put her up here now, the author of, and I'll get this so I can get the title right. Drunk: How we sipped, danced, and stumbled our way to civilization, which I finished reading a couple of weeks ago, and that's when I contacted Edward and that's when he kindly agreed to come and talk to me about it. So I guess the title is fairly self-explanatory. It's a book
Yes, it
about
is. Yeah.
how civilization would. Any civilization, I guess, that has existed in human history would not have existed if we didn't have alcohol. So before we talk about that, I guess I should introduce Edward. You're the professor of, I'm not sure it's a title, Chinese philosophy and religion.
I'm a professor of philosophy now.
Right.
I'm in the philosophy department, so I do early Chinese philosophy and comparative religion, cognitive science, and religion
Right.
as my day job. When I'm not writing books about alcohol. No,
Right. But you're definitely not a professor of alcohol. so
no, no.
so I guess we can maybe, I think it'll become clear actually how you went from the philosophy side around to writing this book. I think that'll become clear as we talk, because and let me summarize the thesis, I suppose, first. Like your
Mhm.
the book is, like I said, it's about, we would not have civilization, even though alcohol may be bad on an individual basis and all of that. It's necessary for civilization, and it led to that through agriculture. It led to the invention of agriculture, and through that to the big civilizations.
Yeah, so there's a couple elements in which alcohol is crucial for civilization, I think. So the standard part of the point of the book is to counter the standard scientific story about why we like to drink. So any Psych 101 textbook, you pick it up, it'll tell you that ethanol just happens to trigger a reward network in the brain, and we're clever primates, and we figure that out. And so there's no good reason that we like alcohol. It's a mistake
Okay.
evolutionarily. Um, and then a kind of parallel to that in terms of history is the standard story that I always learned was that the discovery of alcohol was also a mistake. So first we had agriculture, then someone, left their sourdough starter out too long and it started to ferment, and they tasted it, and wow, we had beer. But that was also kind of a side product of agriculture. Is again the standard story. Um, so I'm trying to flip both of those standard stories and argue, first of all, that there's actually good both individual and social reasons why the taste for alcohol has been preserved in our gene pool and in our cultural repertoire for tens and tens of thousands of years at least. Um, and then historically, to advocate for a movement in archaeology that's sometimes called the beer before bread movement, which was inspired by these relatively recent finds. So archaeology, they started discovering these sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern day Turkey. So the site's 10 to 12,000 years old, and there's no agriculture, just thousands of years before agriculture in that region. But you have hunter gatherers coming together from all over and building this monumental architecture. They're carving these stone stelae and dragging them long distances and raising them up and creating amphitheaters. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the site, but it's very impressive.
Yeah.
And they're doing some sort of rituals. We have no idea what they were doing or what they believed really, but they were feasting and drinking large quantities of liquid because we have these huge vats on the site. And
Okay.
from this particular site, we don't have direct chemical evidence that they were drinking beer, but we know that beer was being made in the region at the time. So it's almost certain they were drinking beer and possibly hallucinogen laced beer. And so the sites like these have made archaeologists start to think, well, maybe it was the other way around. Maybe people discovered how to make beer first or other intoxicating substances, And that is what motivated them to start to try to cultivate crops and settle down and maybe increase the yield. And so the argument of this wing of archaeology is that actually agriculture's in terms of growing food, plants for food, is actually a side effect of beer. We actually, the reason we settled down and started agriculture and therefore started civilization was to get more intoxicating beverages. And you see this, this is bolstered by the fact that across the globe, it seems like the first cultivated crops were chosen for their psychoactive properties, not for their nutrition properties. And so this is a very literal sense in which our taste for beer and other intoxicants led to civilization. It's what
Right.
caused it to settle down.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense when you think, because I remember, I mean, I've read loads of times now that once agriculture was there, like people's health just deteriorated rapidly.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's bad for individuals. Yeah,
Yeah, and so
yeah,
like everyone was shorter, everyone was sicker, so there had to be there had to be some other benefit. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense then that maybe they were all just there because they wanted the drink rather than
yes, they wanted the drink, and it possibly helped them adapt to. One of my arguments is that alcohol also helped us. So it motivated us to start living in these dense agricultural communities, which was definitely, from an individual health perspective, uh, worse than when we were hunter gatherers. You know, we had our diets were less diverse. We were more prone to disease. We're kind of crowded together. It was probably a much more stressful life.
yeah. And I guess when you think about it, I mean, you're talking back to a time when there was maybe 100 million people on the planet, so it's not like they needed to be together. I mean, there was loads
Yeah,
of food, loads they could gather and hunt and that, so there was no shortage as such. So
right,
yeah,
right.
it's not that they were. I guess it's not that people were saying like this is easier to grow this because it was actually more difficult, and so
Hmm.
yeah, the alcohol kind of it makes sense when you put it that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it motivated us to start living in these groups. It helped ease the transition. So one of the individual benefits of alcohol is it's has these anti-anxiety, anti-stress effects, which we still use in modern societies. Right at the end of the day, you have a beer, you get home. They were doing that, 13,000 years ago. So, and then then it gets into some of the stuff I've worked on previously academically, cultural evolutionary theory and kind of group conflict. Once you do get these people who've settled down, they started farming, their population density goes through the roof, they have a more stable source of food, um, they outcompete surrounding hunter gatherers. So surrounding hunter gatherers have to either join that group and take up that lifestyle, or they got to move farther away into less desirable areas. And so what you see today, if you look at the globe, there's still hunter gatherer societies in remote parts of the world, but they're basically just wherever agriculturists didn't want to live.
Okay.
So agriculturalists took over everywhere. So it's not clear, it's not clear any individual hunter gatherer was like, I'd rather live in a dense community and have beer than roam around and fish and hunt. It was just a matter of survival. They really, I think, didn't have a choice. It just the steamroller of agriculture, once it gets going, tends to just make everyone become an agriculturalist.
And do you think that that happened everywhere? Because is it three or five places they think that agriculture was kind of invented independently? So do you think it was the alcohol that was responsible in each of those places?
I think it was one of the motivating factors, and it certainly helped get it off the ground motivationally. It helped people adapt to this new lifestyle, and as I discussed in the book, it also had these group benefits in terms of enhancing group innovation, enhancing group cooperation.
Right. Yeah.
So I think if you're a hunter gatherer, let's say in that region around Göbekli Tepe, and you're having to deal with these groups that have formed into a cohesive band because they're unified around some kind of, these were clearly some kind of religious beliefs. We don't know, some kind of animism. They were worshiping animals or they believed in shamans. We don't know exactly. But you have a tightly, very high population density group that's motivated by shared religious belief. They meet together and drink a lot of beer and affirm their solidarity. um, it's going to be hard to survive against a group like that. So you're probably going to join them. So
Right.
that's probably the way this kind of got off the ground.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Makes sense. But what you're saying then is that okay, so the beer led to the agriculture, which led to the tighter communities, but and that the alcohol helped that, but it also so yeah, maybe this is the point where we get into the benefits of the alcohol itself as to why they were doing it. It's one of the benefits, like you said, is that it helps people kind of work together and group together and that. And I think in the book, like the key in this to you, from what I understand, is the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, yeah. So the two main, so there's the individual benefit of kind of anti-anxiety, enhances relaxation. Most of the book is dedicated to the two most important group benefits. One of them is creativity enhancement. So we're a really unusual species in that we are dependent on technology. We're actually biologically dependent on technology. So our teeth and our digestive system, our jaws have adapted to eating cooked food, which is fire's a technology, right? Babies don't know how to make fire. And we just can't survive in any environment without tools. There's a constant Because of that, there's a kind of constant pressure to be innovating our tool sets. So the environment changes, we need to adapt. Probably more relevantly, we're competing with other cultural groups, and if they have better tools than we do, we're going to lose out. So unlike any other species, lions and gazelles don't get up in the morning and like have strategy meetings about how we're going to change our hunting or fleeing tactics, right? It's all built in genetically. They just do what they're designed to do. Humans aren't like that. We need to create and innovate culturally. And so what I point out in the book is that creates a tension for evolution when it comes to humans because of, as you mentioned, the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is really important part of the brain. It's the last part of the brain to mature. It's the last part of a human being to mature. So
Okay.
it doesn't fully develop until you're in your mid 20s, which is crazy. I mean, really late, and begs explanation. It's weird that it takes so long. And what I argue in the book is that it takes so long because it involves an evolutionary trade off. So we need the PFC to be successful adults. It's the center of what psychologists call executive function or cognitive control. So my ability to show up on time for this meeting, my ability to delay gratification, to plan, to suppress a dominant instinct in the moment for long-term benefit. All the things that kind of make us successful adults, we need a prefrontal cortex for. The problem is it has a couple negative effects, and one of them is that it interferes with creativity. So kids, and I look at some developmental psychology research that shows that little kids are incredibly creative. They can make connections between things, and this our creative ability goes down in a linear fashion as we age. And I show in the book how that pretty much tracks the development of the prefrontal cortex. So as our prefrontal cortex gets stronger and stronger, we get better able to show up on time at work and to go to work instead of going to the park and doing something fun. But we are less able to think outside the box to see connections between unusual things.
Yeah.
And so I think evolution slow walked the PFC because we need to be creative as kids and teenagers to kind of absorb new cultural knowledge and become members of our community. But what would be ideal is if once we're adults and we have this PFC, if occasionally we could just turn it down a few notches. We don't want to become children again because children don't invent anything useful, right? They invent kind of
Yeah.
fun but useless stuff.
Ideas, but nothing.
Um, Nothing that you can really patent, right?
Yeah.
What we need is patentable ideas, and the way you do that is to get grown-ups who have lots of knowledge about the world and who know what's useful and what's not, turn down their PSC a few notches for a few hours and regain some of that cognitive flexibility that they've lost. And so one of my arguments in the book is that one of the crucial functions of alcohol is a cultural technology to do precisely that. So there's very good evidence that if you take the PFC offline through technical means, so you can use a transcranial magnet and zap the PFC, people do better on creativity tests. They go back to being like 5 or 6 year olds on creativity tests. Alcohol is basically a low tech version of a transcranial magnet. One of
Right.
its functions is to just turn down the PFC a few notches. So it's got very complex effects on the body brain system, but and it's both a stimulant and a depressant, which people don't always realize.
Yeah.
But the depressant functions of alcohol are focused on just a few parts of the brain, and one of them is the PFC.
Yeah.
So it's a tool for turning that down a few notches.
Right.
And that's why you see alcohol associated with poets and artists and creative types all across the world and throughout history. There's a really good reason for that.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Does that mean I'm just thinking in the evolutionary terms then? So that means I take it the prefrontal cortex was one of the last parts of the brain to actually develop in an
Oh,
evolutionary.
absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
and there are no other, or do we know, are there other animals that kind of are attracted to alcohol in the same way? So is it like did that kind of attraction to alcohol develop along as a core part of the prefrontal cortex, or
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if it's a core part of the PFC. It definitely is present in other species.
okay,
So birds and certain mammals, if they get a hold of ethanol, they'll drink it and they'll
okay,
get drunk. It has a very similar effect on them. It affects their motor cortex in the way it affects ours. And they seem to like it. So it seems to. It's important to realize that the 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 kind of evolutionary mistake we're just triggering a pleasure circuit in our brain is is just an incomplete explanation. It is actually true that it does make us feel good. So it's down regulating the PFC. It's also upregulating serotonin, endorphins, these kind of feel good chemicals that make us happy, they make us relaxed, they make us like other people more genuinely, and they make us like ourselves more. So alcohol is kind of at the same time turning down the PFC and then pumping up these feel good chemicals in the body. And other animal species get that boost as well. So
okay.
they like it if they can get a hold of it. But it's not having the same benefits for them because they're not having to innovate and create new tool sets in the way we are.
Yeah, the rest
So
of the brain probably isn't as big.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, but the fact that it's there and that it is animals which have a prefrontal cortex as well that are attracted to alcohol, it seems like it is an inherent part of having one.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because birds also enjoy it and don't have a PFC, but they have an area of their brain that's analogous, we
Okay.
think, to the PFC. It's the center of what for them is, cognitive control, executive function. So,
Yeah. So then, if I'm thinking of kind of in as I speak here, but but as the alcohol, as we kind of developed agriculture, it got us into groups because we developed agriculture to get the alcohol because we needed the tools, and that got us into groups. And like you're saying, it then allows us to work together in ways that we otherwise wouldn't. We'd be
mhm,
far too rational or something to work together.
absolutely. So that's the other main function of alcohol socially. It's ramping up creativity on an individual level and also then in a group level because we're all kind of more creative and looser and we're sharing ideas with each other. Um, the other main effect is it helps us to get past these cooperation dilemmas that we have. So we don't necessarily always recognize them, but we constantly face these cooperation dilemmas in our lives that go by various names. Economists call them various things: prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons. The structure is the same though. We basically do better. Everyone does better if we trust each other and cooperate. If we can kind of put aside our own personal self-interest and work for the common good, we actually do better personally in the end. So it's a win-win for everybody if we can do that. The problem is we've opened our in in trusting and cooperating, we open ourselves up to being taken advantage of if other people aren't cooperative. So, you see this in Tragedy of the Commons, right? If I don't get out there and fish up all the tuna and try to leave the tuna so that there are more tuna, somebody else is going to go out and take them
Yeah.
all, and then I'm screwed. But we'd all be better off if we all just stopped fishing for tuna for a little while, right? But there's always cheaters who are going to break the pact, and so we got to be worried about them. In real life, we solve these prisoner's dilemma problems all the time, and we do it because we're not actually rational, self-interested agents. We have these emotions that help us act as groups. So love, loyalty, all these things that cause us to make sacrifices for other people and make us rely on partners. And so humans have these kind of non-rational motivations that make us cooperative. Fortunately, we also, when we have those emotions, we signal them in various ways, in our voices, in our faces, in our body language. And so humans are very attuned to signals of trustworthiness and sincerity. So if I'm meeting you and kind of we're going to have to engage in some venture that requires trust, I'm sussing you out. I'm trying to get a sense if you're really committed to me and you're going to be a good cooperator or not. The This sets up another dynamic where it would be really great if you were actually a cheater, if you were someone who's going to try to take advantage of me. It'd be great if you could fake
Yeah.
being committed. If you could be like, yeah, I'm one of the team, go team, I believe in everything. And then as soon as things go wrong, you're gone. I looked for you for backup and you've disappeared. Um, and so there's going to be a kind of evolutionary arms race between getting better at faking these kind of commitment signals and getting better at detecting faking. What's interesting is that the faking part of it is very PFC heavy.
Okay.
So if I'm going to try to convince you, if you want me to join your army and commit to your God, and I'm pretending to do that, but I'm not really doing it, I've got to keep track of both what I'm telling you is true and what I know to be true. I have to keep those two things separate. I have to really crucially suppress any emotional reactions that come from what I know to be true. And I have to fake emotional reactions that have to do with what I'm telling you to be true. So when you say praise, our God of war, I don't really believe in him, but I've got to look like I believe in him. That requires the PFC to be firing at full force. You really need cognitive control. That's kind of what the PFC is designed for, is kind of tamping down things you need to tamp down, keeping things separate, focusing. And so this is where alcohol comes in again, and the PFC depressing function. If you and I, before I talked to you about how much I love your God and want to be part of your army, we down a few beers. I've now taken that part of my brain that's crucial for faking, and I've basically taken it out and put it on the table and said, I'm cognitively disarmed. You can trust me. And at the same time, I'm ramping up these feel good chemicals that actually make it less likely for me to want to lie to you or cheat. So it's this. I compare it to when we meet and we shake hands with strangers. The origin of that is to show that I'm not carrying a weapon in my dominant hand, right? Um, Drinking beers is just like shaking hands. It's cognitively disarming. It's taking out your prefrontal cortex and saying, I am deliberately impairing my ability to lie to you, so you can trust me more than you would be able to otherwise.
Right. So
And
it's
so
kind of
that's why
it's kind of a truth serum.
it's a true serum. And it's why, again, across the world throughout history, anytime you get potentially hostile people or people with differing interests who have to come to an agreement, they sit down and the alcohol comes out. and if the few cultures that don't have alcohol use another chemical intoxicant that has very similar properties, they use cannabis or they use kava in the Pacific. So it's this really crucial social lubricant and social trust creating device that works from every scale, from kind of high level diplomacy. When Nixon went to China, he famously said, if we drink enough Mao Tai, we can solve anything. We sit down, we do some shots, we'll figure it out. All the way down to, a couple 20-year-olds on a first date, where they're nervous and they want to get to know someone. You're using alcohol as a social lubricant to help break down inhibitions and be more sincere and honest.
Yeah.
So it has this really crucial social lubricating, social glue function that we've been, again, using for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, no, and yeah, like you said, we still do. I mean, it is, you go out work parties, or it does kind of get a group and give them something to bond over, or by kind of meshing that. I don't know. It's kind of meshing a bigger group into one. Because I guess what it's effectively doing when it's shutting that down is it's kind of subsuming you into the group. You're losing your identity a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look at some experimental evidence on that. So there's a great study where Michael Sayette, who's done a lot of the pioneering work in alcohol at Pittsburgh, put subjects in a situation where they sat down at a table with three other strangers and had to just chat about stuff. And he had, alcohol condition. He had a placebo condition where they thought they were drinking, but they weren't. And so he could really separate out the chemical effect of ethanol and not just the placebo effect of having a drink. And the group that had genuine ethanol containing drinks, I show a photo of it in the book. They're having a really good time. They're smiling genuine Duchenne smiles, the sincere smile. They report liking the other people in the group more. They report feeling, as you pointed out, he gave them a task where you draw a circle and kind of show a circle for you and circle for the others. Their circles converge a lot more. They felt part of the group. So there's good evidence. We know people have been doing this intuitively for a really long time, but now we actually understand kind of why it works the way it does. It's because it's, ramping up these bonding hormones and turning down suspicion and ability to lie and ability to cheat.
Right. I mean, that it doesn't mean. I guess this is maybe a question I hadn't thought through, but I mean, it doesn't mean that teetotal societies don't work, but it doesn't mean that it's a bit harder for them, that they have to work harder to make the society work, or.
I think it does mean that. And so, there are societies that don't use alcohol. Many of them just substitute another chemical intoxicant that does the same thing. But some don't use chemical intoxicants at all. And my argument there is what you see in those societies is there are other ways to do this. So, for instance, sleep deprivation, repetitive singing or dancing, physical pain, hunger, starving yourself can help you do this. Extreme exercise can do it as well. It's kind of that's where the runner's high comes from.
Okay.
So in groups that don't use chemical intoxicants, what you often see is they have these rituals that involve some of these other components. So they stay up all night and dance like the Sufis. Pentecostals engage in these hours long church sessions where they're chanting and getting up and getting down and exhausting their bodies to the point that they start speaking in tongues and having these experiences that make them seem famously in the New Testament. I think it's Peter or Paul observes people speaking in tongues, and passersby say, "Oh, they must be drunk."
Okay.
And he says, "No, they're drunk on the Holy Spirit." But that's very revealing that passersby thought they were drunk on alcohol, because it's the same physiological effect. So you dance, you sing, you exhaust your body, you turn your PFC down, because PFC is the most recent evolutionarily novel part of the brain. And so when you stress your body at a certain point, your body's like, okay, we don't need that part anymore. That's a new part. We can let that, go for a while. We need to put the blood to the heart and the lungs and the
Okay.
really important parts of the body. And you get some endorphin and serotonin boost from that as well. So you can get the same kind of combination of physiological effects through other types of physical stress or physical practices. It just takes a lot longer, and as I say in the book, I think it's just kind of a hassle. So, it's if you have this tool that does it really quickly and effectively and in a pleasant way, it shouldn't be surprising that most groups
Mhm.
use that technology.
All right. And yeah, so I mean, I know which one I'd rather do a few pints or, but
Yeah, yeah,
but I mean, the key to this as well, I think, is what you're saying, or from what you said in the past, is that the alcohol, like if you're doing all these other methods, one, like you said, it's an awful lot more hassle. It takes longer, takes a lot more energy in that. But also, it's you can dose alcohol. You know how much you're taking and what the effect is.
absolutely.
Where
Yeah.
and that's a key.
Yeah, it's much harder to dose that stuff, right? I've gotta make sure that you're sleep depriving yourself just as much as me.
Yeah.
It's gonna affect you differently. Especially the fact that modern societies are weird and that we can try all kinds of new alcohols that we've never had before. But for almost all of our evolutionary history, we're drinking something that our parents drank, that our grandparents drank, that our great grandparents drank. It hasn't changed. So we know exactly what the effects are going to be. We know exactly how to dose it. And so it really is. I mean, I've gotten a lot of questions about cannabis. So why alcohol?
Yeah.
Because cannabis has some of the same effects. It downregulates PFC, it pumps up some of these feel good chemicals. It also has the advantage of being a lot less dangerous. So it's less harmful physiologically, and it's not physically addictive. One of the big problems with ethanol is it's really
Yeah.
addictive physically. Um, so it does seem like cannabis should have won out. So in kind of the competition between these chemical intoxicants, cannabis seems to have a lot of advantages. But I think the two crucial disadvantages are is cannabis is hard to dose. So if you're smoking it, you've got to really know how to hold it in your lungs. And if you're not breathing as deeply as someone else, you're not going to get the same effect. If you're taking it orally, if you're using edibles, the delay between when you take it and when it has its effects is so long that it's again notoriously hard to dose. People have edibles, nothing's happening, they take some more, and then it's like, oh boy, I shouldn't have taken more. Um, but so that's one problem, and then the other, I think, the really fatal flaw of cannabis is that it has really variable effects across individuals.
Okay.
So some people, I remember in college, I had friends who smoke and want to go out dancing or talk philosophy or make them very energetic and social and 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 talkative. It would me, and this is right now with legal cannabis, I've been able to try every possible strain, every type. It always has the same effect on me. It makes me feel stupid and paranoid and mute, and then I go to sleep. So it's just it's not a useful social drug for me, and so that's a problem. You can't have as your main social drug
Something.
something that's going to be affecting different people in different ways,
Yeah.
whereas ethanol seems to have very consistent effects across individuals.
Okay. And then at the time, I mean, for most of history, then like beer was, or the alcohol you got was quite weak. It wasn't very strong either. Like,
Yeah,
so yeah, so you were able to predict it. But actually, one of the things from talking to people, I've been talking to numbers of brewers and historians that, I mean, the history of alcohol, of beer, is like brewing was always considered one, it was a female thing, but it was more like magic. It was seen as a very ritualized, very,
yeah,
very controlled, mysterious sort of spiritual
yeah.
activity, and that
Yeah, it is mysterious. Fermentation's mysterious, right? If you
yeah,
don't know about yeast, which you can't see, right?
yeah,
It must seem like magic.
Yeah.
You put this together, and then something happens, and then suddenly it affects you in a completely different way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's always been ritualized. This is, part of the book is talking about why alcohol is so much more dangerous in the modern world than it
Yeah.
historically has been. And one of those reasons, well, it's linked. So making alcohol was always ritualized, and the consumption of alcohol was always ritualized. So the ability to drink privately is a really new thing. You never had private access to alcohol historically. It was always drunk in a ritual setting. Even there are some cultures where the alcohol production does happen in the household, but in those societies, typically there's a taboo against drinking your own alcohol. So you produce it there, but you share it with your neighbors and you drink it in public. And so that we have all these ritual ways of kind of moderating each other's drinking.
Yeah.
And you see this everything. I talk about some kind of ancient formal rituals like the Greek symposium and Chinese drinking banquets where there's ways of pacing the drinking. But you even see it today in modern pub culture, right? You go to a pub, typically you drink in rounds,
Yeah.
right? So if you have a problem with alcohol and you suck down your Guinness and you want another one, you can't have another one.
Yeah.
Until I'm done with mine, right? Until we order another round. And that's a very effective way to kind of both keep everyone at the same level of
Yeah.
inebriation, but also help moderate your drinking if you have a drinking problem, right? You've got to kind of pace yourself with us.
Yeah.
Um, and ideally, drink servers and bartenders are also serving as kind of modern versions of the symposiarch, the person who controlled the ancient Greek drinking parties. They're going to slow you down if they think you're drinking too much, or even tell you no. Um, all of that is thrown out the window when you can sit at home and have a case of vodka delivered to your apartment, and drink it in front of TV with no one moderating you. Um, and then the second problem is distilled liquor. So, you know, almost all of our history, we've been drinking naturally fermented beverages. Distillation is a really recent invention. I mean, we've known about it for a very long time, but it's conceptually simple, but it's technically very difficult to pull off.
Okay.
And we haven't had the technology to do it on a large scale until really like the 1600s in
Okay.
Europe, which, I'm telling a story that starts 10 million years ago with our primate ancestors. So that's yesterday.
Yeah.
Um, and it basically removes a safety feature that alcohol has always had. So with natural fermentation, as you know, the alcohol eventually shuts down the yeast. And so there's kind of a ceiling on how strong a beer or a wine can get. With distillation, you take that ceiling away. You can just, you get these crazy 90 something percent alcohol beverages. And our body brain systems are just not designed to handle alcohol at that level of concentration. It completely overwhelms our natural detoxification procedures. And you can go, most of the benefits that I talk about for alcohol happen at about 0.08 blood alcohol content. They're
Okay.
like one or two beers, depending on how big you are and if you've eaten recently. Um, you're doing shots of tequila, you could blow past that in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's really, as you say, for almost all of our history, we've mostly been drinking. Most of the world's been drinking weak beers, so 2 to 3% ABV beers, and those you can drink all day long
Yeah.
and really never get dangerously intoxicated. So, yeah, one, we do have now this kind of phenomenon with craft brewing where they're kind of pushing yeast. We bred these
Yeah.
super hardy yeast so we could make these crazy like AAA IPAs. But that's not normal. Like that's not what we've been drinking.
Yeah. So
So
even the
we've been
beers are
drinking.
stronger.
Yeah, the beer. So even the beer is stronger. The wines are stronger. We've been relentlessly pushing yeast to get tougher and tougher so we could make higher ABV beverages. But that's, you can only go so far. I mean, that maxes out at about 16, maybe 17%. But that's why distillation is such a dangerous innovation, because we just completely frog the limitations of natural fermentation.
Yeah, and you can, yeah, because you can drink it so fast before you can have, well, I mean, in theory, you could have a bottle gone before it's kind of started being processed by your.
Yeah, yeah.
Hopefully, nobody nobody drinks it that fast, but yeah, I mean,
Well,
even if you're
people
drinking,
people people who drink themselves to death do, right? So that's the only way you could drink to the point of depressing your, because eventually you'll depress your central nervous system and stop
yeah,
breathing. It's with beer, you just physically can't get there, right? You just can't drink that much volume of beer because your stomach
yeah,
can't hold it. You can only drink, you can get like blind drunk only on distilled liquors, really, because they're so powerful.
yeah. So, and like I said, that's what 400 years worth, which is nothing in
Nothing.
evolution
Yeah.
terms. Like even in society terms, it's practically nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you compare it back to ancient Rome or something. So actually, that's a question again, random question, but do they know, since we're talking about strengths? Do you know what kind of alcohol of say ancient Roman wines were? Would they be? They wouldn't be up to 16% either. They'd probably be a lot lower. Would
No, no, they were drinking fruit wines that probably in a pure form were probably maybe 5% ABV.
okay. Okay.
But they actually watered, the Romans and the Greeks watered their wine down. They didn't
Yeah.
drink it straight. They thought drinking unwatered wine was a barbarian practice. So, so they in the symposium, the host of the symposium had a big bowl that would have wine in it, and then part of their job was to water it down. And so, if things were a little bit boring, maybe they'd only put a little bit of water and they'd pass it around. If things were getting out of hand, they'd start watering it down more. But yeah, so they were, with the watering down, they were probably drinking something more like 2 to 3%
Okay.
ABV.
Yeah, because I don't know, I just have the image of these big Roman parties, big
Yeah,
Roman orgies, the whole lot that they were pure bacchanalian things.
yeah,
So you
yeah.
have this idea that they're drinking something very strong.
Yeah. Well, they probably, at a certain part of the evening, maybe they started drinking unwatered wine and things got a
Okay.
little bit out of hand. But yeah, they didn't have distilled liquors. They were
Yeah.
drinking naturally fermented wine. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so I mean that comes back to like where you came into this, how you went from your professor of philosophy into writing a book about being drunk was
Yeah.
because this was a religious ritual. It was a religious, which was sometimes done like it was part of a religious ritual, or if it wasn't, then it was kind of mimicking. It was the easy way into a religious ritual. So it's doing the same thing as an organized religion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's two connections with my previous work. One is a lot of my early work focused on spontaneity and the importance of uh, this idea in early Chinese. It's called wu wei, effortless action, or kind of spontaneous ease. So the early Chinese thinkers I look at all want you to get into this state of effortless action where you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, you stop monitoring yourself, everything's flowing kind of effortlessly. Um, the problem is that there's a paradox. So that my first popular book was called Trying Not to Try,
Okay.
after this paradox of how do you try not to try.
Yeah.
So if I tell you, if you know that you're going to be a better podcast interviewer if you're relaxed and you kind of let the conversation flow and you don't, don't be too uptight about it. If I tell you don't be so uptight, it immediately makes you uptight, right? If I tell you relax, you immediately tense up, because the part of the brain that processes that message and then tries to do something is the prefrontal cortex. And so I'm activating the part of your brain that I actually want to shut down. And so it's a real cognitive paradox. And so in my academic work and in this first trade book, I looked at how these early Chinese thinkers tried various strategies for getting around the paradox that look like some of these non-chemical religious techniques. So, sit this way and breathe and count your breaths. or do these rituals until the rituals become second nature and you don't notice you're doing the rituals anymore. They gave you things to do with your body to kind of trick yourself into being spontaneous. And they work. There's a good reason these techniques survived. But I did start to think about, there's a story in one of these Taoist texts of a drunken person. He's a guy, it says the drunken person's riding on a cart, and if he falls out, he's not hurt because he didn't know he was riding and he doesn't know that he's fallen out. So his spirit is whole. So kind of a drunk person falling downstairs often doesn't get hurt because they don't tense up. Um, and then the story concludes, if you can do this, if you can make your spirit whole with alcohol, how much better would it be if you were drunk on heaven? So if you were intoxicated with spiritual energy. So that's a great story, and it's clearly just using alcohol as an analogy for the spiritual state. But that story made me think, alcohol's still it's pretty good. It works. And so I think that was the kernel of me starting to think about, hey, maybe alcohol is a technology that we've developed to get around this paradox of how to try not to try. So I'm going to go on a date. I know that the date's going to go better if I'm relaxed and spontaneous and funny. But if I'm trying to be funny, I'm not going to be funny. And if I tell myself to stop trying, I'm just going to get more tense. What if I, at the beginning of the date, start sipping a glass of wine? That's going to go in and turn down my PFC without me having to do anything. So that I got interested because of my interest in spontaneity. I got interested in alcohol as a tool for getting around this cognitive paradox. And then the second connection is I've always been interested in what I think of as mysteries hiding in plain sight about human behavior. And so previously I studied religion from this perspective. So we take it for granted that everywhere we go, people build huge monuments to invisible beings, and they bury some proportion of their gross national product in the ground with dead people, and they cut the tips of their penises off, and they don't eat pork, and they sit in boring ceremonies on their day off from work. That all, we don't blink an eye. But if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's really puzzling because it's very costly.
Yeah.
And it's apparently useless unless you believe that, the first emperor of Qin really, is going to go in the afterlife and enjoy all this stuff. You would think that cultures, for instance, in China, they built this huge underground city with a huge fake army for the first emperor of Qin, and then they just buried it. It's gone. All that stuff's just gone.
Yeah.
And you would think that if there was a neighboring group that did the same stuff, but they built a real city and a real army, they would do better than this one that wasted all this stuff on the ground. But that's not what we see. Cultures that build huge pyramids and cathedrals, they do well. And so when you see people engaged in apparently harmful, costly, useless behavior, but it's ubiquitous, so you see it all over the world, and it's ancient, so we've been doing it for as long as we know. There's got to be something else going on. There's got to be something in the benefit column that's paying for the costliness. And so I started to feel like alcohol was a similar type of phenomenon, right? We're not puzzled. We show up in a new culture, they're drinking at dinners, and they welcome you with intoxicating beverages. And but we should be more puzzled by that than we have been. So I'm trying to both problematize what we take for granted, that people like intoxicants, and then try to figure out what's in the positive column that's paying for it. And I don't think that's something anyone's ever really done systematically before.
Right. And so, like you said, the positive column is not so much about the individual, but it's about the society, about the group. Which, I mean, I suppose you can follow that down, like you said, asking questions and like what's evolving what the evolution is. Are you at an evolutionary, like, is evolution no longer kind of biological thing, or is it a society thing? You can get off into all sorts
Yeah.
of all sorts of philosophical debates there.
Yeah, well, I am working with a what's called in academic cognitive science work, dual inheritance theory, or gene culture coevolution, it's sometimes called. So, arguing that evolution's happening both at the genetic level, and that's slow,
Yeah,
um, and then at the cultural level, which is very fast. So cultures can mutate very quickly, and so yeah, I'm looking at it from both angles, and they're both genetic and cultural evolutionary reasons why alcohol has been preserved as both a cultural practice and as a kind of biological
right.
desire we have, because it does make us feel good.
Yeah,
We
and
do
there's
want
kind
to
of a
do it
tension.
individually.
There's kind of a tension at those two levels, then as well, I suppose.
There can be, yeah, there often is, yeah.
Um, yeah, just on what. Sorry, I'm trying to think back there. Yeah, so like you were saying that alcohol is kind of the easy way into a religious experience in many ways. That thing, but is it new that we're kind of puritanical about it? Like you were saying, like, doing the work of sitting down and meditating for 10 hours a day or dancing all night. And people kind of see that as having value, but sitting down and having a few pints, they don't quite see with the same
Yeah,
value. Is that new, or is it?
it is a bit. I mean, you see hints of it in this ancient Taoist story, right? They're using the drunkenness as just a metaphor for the real spiritual state, which you get through meditation. Um, but the 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 kind of valorizing the hard way to get there, and looking down on the easy way to get there, the the intensity of it has really ramped up in our modern world. So you see it in academia, where my area, religious studies, the famous big book on shamanism by Eliade, who's one of the founders of the field, um, dismissed any kind of chemically induced spiritual state as just faking it, as
Okay.
artificial mysticism. Um, but it's really why. I mean, just biophysically, it's the same state. Whether you got there through meditating all night or drinking a couple pints of beer. There's also this weird, and particularly kind of Anglo-American society, there's a weird Puritanism, and it's worse in Canada and the States, obviously, because that's where these kind of crazy Puritans went when they didn't feel at home, in England or wherever, where we kind of demonize alcohol, but also then indulge in it in this kind of excessive way. We have a very, I think, unhealthy relationship with alcohol in the States and in Canada, and to some extent across Northern Europe. So I talk in the book about healthier versus not healthy drinking cultures, and anthropologists contrast Northern and Southern European cultures.
Yeah.
So in the North, you're drinking a lot of distilled liquor. You're drinking to get drunk. You're drinking in single sex groups. So usually a bunch of dudes together, but women will do it together. But typically single sex groups drinking to get drunk. Um, it's forbidden to children. It's a kind of taboo thing that you can't have if you're a kid. Um, that leads to dangerous drinking practices. And if you contrast that with Southern cultures, like Italy or Spain, you're drinking more wines and beers. You're only drinking at the meal table in mixed groups. You know, the parents, the kids, the grandparents, the dogs under the table. Everyone's eating. Everyone's having a little bit to drink. The kids get a little bit to drink from a very early age. In Italy, my ex-wife is half Italian, so we spent a lot of time in Italy, and kids will get a little bit of wine mixed with water. Just everyone, just to show them that this is part of a meal. Um, you don't drink away from the meal table. When the meal is over, the drinking is over. And drinking to the point that you get visibly intoxicated is considered shameful. You, as a grown-up, you do not do that.
Right.
And so, if you see some drunk people wandering around central Rome, they're Irish tourists. They're not locals. So and that leads to lower. So if you look at alcoholism levels, Italy, at least until recently, led for per capita alcohol consumption. They drank the most alcohol per capita of any country in Europe, but I think they had the lowest alcoholism rates. So you can drink a lot, but drink safely if you have a particular style of drinking.
Right.
And with these northern cultures, what you see is very high alcoholism rates, and that northern drinking culture got exported to North America and to Australia and New Zealand, and so you see these kind of both kind of demonization, but also overindulgence in alcohol, and these kind of more fraught relationships to alcohol in societies like that.
Yeah, and I guess then if you're looking at it like that, I mean, Italy, like you said, if it's drinking almost constantly, let's put it that way, like because you might
Mm-hmm.
be drinking, during the day, but in small amounts,
Yeah.
you're fulfilling its purpose of being a lubricant for the whole community, I guess. Whereas if you're doing it as you've got a group of 3 or 4 lads going out just to get hammered on a night, then it's not forming a group; it's forming a subgroup. Or
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's true too. Yeah, you're forming little cliques
yeah,
that could be actually really counterproductive for the society as a whole. Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah.
You're fragmenting in a way.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, just as a comparison, I mean, and I guess this is to do with driving as well. But I mean, if you look back at things from the '70s, and like they were always, even in places like England, and that they were having liquid lunches. But that
Yeah,
seems to
yeah,
have gone now. That's
yeah.
frowned upon. But like you said, maybe they're more excessive than in the evening. But like I was talking to someone a few weeks ago, and they recreated a 16th century brewery, and
Uh,
they were saying that the beers were about 5%, but
okay.
according to the records, they used to like I don't know which organization it was now, but they used to give like depending on what job you did because you got it as part of your wages. But if you were a bricklayer or something equivalent to that, you were getting up to 10 pints a day of five.
Yeah, 5% beer.
Yeah,
Wow,
so
that's serious.
and I was
Yeah,
trying to figure out like why aren't they drunk all the
yeah,
time? But I guess
yeah.
it's part of that as well. Like if you're drinking it as a constant low level, you have a certain acclimation to it. Which
Yeah, that's interesting. And you're maybe slightly buzzed the whole
yeah, but
workday, but you're not getting,
yeah,
falling down drunk.
yeah, and health and
Or
safety wouldn't have been so high. Wouldn't have
yeah,
been back then.
right. Yeah. And you also, another novel thing that makes alcohol so much more dangerous is motor vehicles. The fact that we can now operate motor vehicles is insane. Um, so you combine much more powerful alcohol, kind of less social control over drinking, and access to motorized vehicles. That's a toxic mix.
It's not a good one at all.
Yeah.
And so where do you? What's your next book? So, are you going to stay focused on drinking, or do you have something in mind, or what's your next project?
The next book is actually going to be on hedonism.
Okay.
So near the end of Drunk, I point out an irony, which is that the if I'm going to tell an evolutionary story about the functions of alcohol, it can't have to do with pleasure because evolution doesn't care about pleasure.
Right.
So the benefits have to be something that matters for evolution. So individual success, group success. But at the end of the book, I say, I'm talking about Dionysus and Apollo. Apollo's rational and kind of instrumental, and Dionysus is ecstatic and absorbed in the world. And I point out that I've basically been making an Apollonian argument for Dionysus. Here's this kind of scientific, functional reasons why the taste for alcohol was part of the human motivation system. But in the conclusion, I point out, well, also it feels good and it tastes good. It's fun, and that should matter too. And we do have this kind of allergy to pleasure and talking about something just for pleasure's sake.
Yeah.
And it goes back to Puritanism and certain strains of Protestantism in particular that then get morphed into in kind of the West Coast of North America, where I spent most of my adult life. They get morphed into these weird kind of neo-asceticism. So instead of wearing hair shirts or wearing plain clothes and praying for 4 hours a day, I do sunrise yoga, and I only drink these kind of awful organic beverages, and and my body is a temple, and I don't pollute it with alcohol or any kind of bad substances. And it's almost a kind of new form of Puritanism. um, and it's kind of profoundly anti-pleasure for pleasure's sake. Everything's got to be because it's increasing your productivity. Why do you do this? Because it's making you more productive. um, and so I kind of want to throw a little sand in the gears of that and say, there's something to be said for just pleasure for pleasure's sake. And really what we're designed to be as organisms is fully embodied, engaged with the world, and experiencing pleasure. And so it's going to be a defense of kind of simple pleasures in life, like a nice pint of beer, a good meal, gardening, getting in touch with the natural world again. So that's going to be the next trade book.
Okay. Well, it
So,
sounds like noble work. Let's put it that way.
thanks.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
like I said, nobody. Yeah, that it is all becoming just very focused world. Very, yeah, like I said, it's all about productivity. When we
yeah,
should be
yeah.
able.
You should read. There's a great book. Stuart Walton is a UK journalist and author, and he's got a book called. The original title was Out of It, and I think it was re-released with a new title. But he's done a great job of making this point that let's talk about pleasure without shame and without all this kind of Victorian hedging and hawing. And so he was an inspiration in that last part of Drunk, and the follow-up book is going to be focusing more solidly on why we shouldn't be afraid of pleasure. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it because I really did enjoy this. Yeah. So I guess I'll let you go. I'm sure you've things to be doing. I
Yeah.
really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat, though. I really really enjoyed it. I
Yeah,
can't
thanks a lot.
believe an hour flew by, but
Yeah, yeah. No, this was a lot of fun.
good. All right. Listen, thanks a million. And yeah, maybe when your next book comes out, maybe we can kind of chat again at some stage.
Great.
All
All
right.
right.
Thanks a million.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.